we're so excited to welcome back Drake Pike to the area and his family. So thank you so much for being here. Yeah. With that, Vicki Tobias is also here. She's a genealogist and historical researcher for Madison, Wisconsin. And so for the past several years, her and Drake have been working on not one, but two projects regarding the Pike family. Drake is writing a biography of his great-grandfather, Robinson Durling Pike, R.D. Pike, as you can find in our exhibit over there. And Vicki's putting together a genealogical history of the entire Pike family from the colonial era on. So that will be really exciting to see those come into fruition. Tonight we'll start with Vicki. She'll take us back to Bayfield's earlier years, even before Bayfield was founded. In 1855, Elisha Pike, so it'd be Drake Pike's great-grandfather and R.D. Pike's father, settled and homesteaded out on Pikes Creek. So she'll go over that, as he was one of our very early Bayfield pioneers. And then that will be about half hour-ish, and then Drake will talk about R.D. Pike's Civil War experience. So we'll get into that. As we know, R.D. Pike was very proud of that time of his life and status as a Union Army veteran. But up till now, we don't know much about it and what he did in the war, so we're about to find out. And Drake will tell us all about that. So with a warm welcome, let's start with Vicki Tobias first on Elisha Pike, and there she is. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here tonight to share Elijah Pike Jr.'s story with you all. So most Bayfield origin stories, many Bayfield origin stories begin with R.D. Pike, but tonight I'm starting one generation earlier with his father, Elijah Pike Jr. So if you're familiar with Bayfield history at all, you likely know a little bit about the story. Elijah Pike Jr. arrived on Madeline Island in June 1855, officially to recover from malaria he had contracted in Ohio. He traveled north to one of the fastest changing regions on the Great Lakes, encouraged by family friend Frederick Prentice, a name familiar with to some of you who know Bayfield history, and others who are already promoting Lake Superior's opportunities. But unlike many visitors who only stopped at La Pointe, Elijah crossed over to the mainland. Bayfield didn't yet exist, but there was an abandoned sawmill south of town near what would become Pikes Creek. I think Elijah saw opportunity there before most others did. Literally within weeks, he purchased the sawmill and the property, returned to Ohio, gathered his family, and relocated north in October 1855, and that decision placed the Pike family at the very beginning of Bayfield's history. Very cool. But before Elijah Pike ever arrived on the shores of Lake Superior, he had already spent a lifetime moving across the American frontier. He was born in Malta, Maine in 1813 into a large family with 11 siblings, led by his father, also Elijah Pike Sr., and his mother, Sally Hanson Pike, another Sally. In 1819, when he was about 5 years old, the family relocated from Maine to Meade Township in Crawford County, Pennsylvania. Like many families of the period, the Pikes moved west in search of land and opportunity. So I'm skipping over a whole bunch of Pike family history that I'll be thrilled to tell you about if you're interested. But one really fun connection we discovered from those early Maine years, during the War of 1812, Elijah Pike Sr. served in a volunteer militia led by his neighbor and good friend, Gideon Barton, who was the uncle of Clara Barton, the founder of the American Red Cross, and their family was also from that area. We found a wonderful diary from Kennebec County, Maine. Gideon Barton kept extensive documents in diaries, and he talked a lot about Elijah Pike Sr. They were neighbors, they were friends, they traded labor, they were connected at that time in his life. So one thing that became clear in researching the Pike family across many generations, land acquisition was kind of their family business. And I don't mean in the modern corporate sense, but generation after generation, the Pikes built stability and wealth through buying, improving, and passing along land. So you can actually see this happen in the Crawford County, Pennsylvania tax rolls. There's a table here on this slide. As Pike family members, Elijah Pike Sr. and his sons steadily acquired land across the area between 1819 and 1845. You can see down at the very bottom, Elijah Pike Jr. Begins to accumulate his own property towards the end of the 1830s. So for frontier families, it's important to remember that land meant security and opportunity. Elijah Pike Jr. grew up inside of that system. In both Maine and Pennsylvania, he learned farming, timber work, and what I think is a central lesson of frontier life. Buy land when you can, improve it, and then let it build your future. And he carried that mindset everywhere he went. In Pennsylvania, Ohio, and then later in Wisconsin, he continued buying, improving, and strategically selling property over time. And if you know anything about R.D. Pike, that sounds kind of familiar. R.D. Pike, his son, followed that same pattern, eventually acquiring extensive land holdings across Wisconsin, Minnesota, and California. I have to mention, Elijah Pike Sr. shows up in the old Crawford County newspapers quite frequently. And it's always a well-intended ad placed in the paper. Somebody lost a horse. Come get your missing horse. Did you lose money on my property? Come claim it. A really honest fellow, right? Anyone else would have kept the money or kept the horse, but not Elijah Sr. I love that. So while the Pike family, while they were establishing themselves in Crawford County, Pennsylvania, they became closely connected to another frontier family living on adjoining property, the Peter and Ruth Kimmy family. 3 Pike siblings eventually married 3 Kimmy siblings, including Elijah Pike Jr. and Elizabeth Kimmy, who were married on December 31st, 1835. It was in Pennsylvania that Elijah and Elizabeth Pike began their own family. Their son R.D. was born there in 1838, followed by daughter Adeline in 1840. So you can see we found one other photo of a Kimmy and a Pike who married, and I find it astonishing how much of a resemblance there is between the siblings, John Pike and Elijah Pike Sr. or Jr. and Nancy Kimmy and Elizabeth Kimmy. So Elijah Pike Jr. had a much smaller household, just 2 children, R.D. and Adeline, which I think made repeated relocation much more manageable and affordable. Eventually, Elijah Pike Jr. assumed responsibility for his aging mother, Sally Pike, who joined their household in 1845 after his father passed away. Another fun discovery in our research over the past few years, Elijah Pike Jr. and R.D. Pike, that part of the family, they were not the only Pikes to end up in Wisconsin and Bayfield. Elijah's brothers Moses and Joshua and several nieces and nephews from the extended Pike Kimmy network also found their way to Wisconsin, and a few of them here in Bayfield. So after his father died in 1845, Elijah Pike Jr. relocated and established himself in Perrysburg Township, Ohio, right along the Maumee River south of Toledo, where timber shipping on Lake Erie and rising land values were reshaping that region. It's important to note at this point that Elijah Pike was not as wealthy as some of the other early Bayfield investors, but he was also not an impoverished settler heading west out of desperation. He occupied kind of a middle ground in frontier America. He was incredibly financially stable. He was experienced, resourceful, and successful in each location he lived. For example, in 1850, he purchased 80 acres for just $169 over the next several years. As land values rose, he sold portions of that property for roughly $1,300, which was a substantial profit. And some of that profit he used to relocate to Wisconsin. But thinking about his relocation to Wisconsin, I think it's revealing how he handled that risk. He did not gamble everything on his eventual move to Bayfield. He actually held back property in Ohio for several years as insurance, I think, if the Wisconsin plan failed. That was pretty smart. He ended up selling his last chunk of property in Ohio, I think in 1858. So he gave it a few years to see if it was going to, give it a go here in Bayfield. So while luck certainly mattered in Bayfield's early years for Elijah, I think he consistently recognized opportunity at the right moments. He was ambitious, he was careful, and I think he was really strategic. Another fun find in researching this period of his life, he not only invested in land, but in community institutions. Kind of sounds like his son R.D. In Perrysburg Township in Ohio, he helped establish one of the first school districts, and he served as a school director. I suspect probably because his kids, R.D. and Adeline, needed a school. Makes sense. So he didn't just settle in developing places. He helped build the institutions that made them livable. Again, I think another characteristic later shared by his son, R.D. Excuse me. So here's where the familiar Bayfield origin story begins. In the early 1850s, the Elijah Pike family was living in northwestern Ohio near the Great Black Swamp, along the Maumee River south of Toledo, a region at that time that was notorious for malaria, cholera, and generally poor health conditions. It was not a pleasant place to live. Elijah Pike did contract malaria, and I suspect probably other family members as well. But I think illness alone does not explain why he chose to travel hundreds of miles north to the shores of Lake Superior. During that time, Lake Superior was rapidly attracting settlers and investors. Keep in mind the Sioux Locks in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan opened in May of 1855, and that connected Lake Superior to Lakes Huron and Michigan, and also allowed easier access to the Lake Superior region. But here's another interesting discovery we made, and this is where Frederick Prentice enters the story. Elijah Pike's Ohio neighbor was Augustus Prentice, Frederick Prentice's brother. And Augustus Prentice unfortunately died during a cholera outbreak in late 1854. Augustus's brother was Frederick Prentice, and Frederick already knew Lake Superior country very well. He had been up here previously, and he was the one that encouraged Elijah to travel north in June of 1855 to recover his health, likely describing a place of cool air, clean water, and relief from the Ohio swamps. But Frederick Prentice, I think, was also introducing Elijah to a rapidly developing region, and that connection with Prentice, later known for his brownstone quarries and his company in Bayfield, remained really important for years afterward and helped both Elijah and R.D. establish themselves in Bayfield. So perhaps Elijah's journey north was never simply a health trip at all. I think once he saw Lake Superior and thought about what he had back home in Perrysburg and the opportunities forming along the south shore of Lake Superior, he never truly looked back. So after arriving at La Pointe on Madeline Island in June 1855, Elijah Pike made a remarkably fast decision. He was not simply visiting Lake Superior to recover his health. I think he intended to invest in it right away. The attraction was not just a healthier climate, it was an old sawmill, and some of you know this story well. Near what would later become Pikes Creek stood an aging sawmill, a cabin, and attractive land left over from the region's older fur trade economy. Property once owned by John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company and sold to Elijah Pike by Julius Austrian. Most people probably saw an isolated, deteriorating property miles from any established settlement. I think Elijah Pike saw the future. He arrived just as the South Shore was shifting from fur trade to lumber and more permanent settlement. And a sawmill, I think, was a smart and logical gamble in a region that was preparing to grow. So again, strategic, optimistic. And Elijah also structured the deal quite carefully. He bought the property on time, an installment plan, preserving much of his capital, and then again retaining a pretty big chunk of property in Ohio as a financial safety net if Wisconsin failed. So he took a calculated risk, and within weeks, he returned to Ohio, gathered his family and household goods, and prepared to move north in October 1855. We're lucky that in later years, his son R.D. Pike described that difficult journey to Lake Superior aboard the new sidewheel steamer, the Planet. After storms and delays, the family finally reached the point, crossed over to the mainland, and arrived at Pikes Creek just in time for their first Wisconsin winter, which I'm sure they loved. And with that journey, the Pike family became part of Bayfield's history. So, as many of you know, in the beginning, there were no streets, no business district, no harbor town, just a forest, shoreline, indigenous communities, and speculation about what this place might someday become. So when we say Elisha Pike was one of the town of Bayfield's earliest residents, we really do mean earliest. Both Elijah and young R.D. witnessed one of the defining moments in Bayfield history, the surveying and platting of the town site in 1856. But it's important to note that right away, Elisha Pike focused on survival. Upon arrival in 1855, he immediately repaired the old sawmill on Pikes Creek. He restarted lumber production, he cleared land, he planted crops, he raised livestock, and he established one of the area's first productive farms. And that mattered enormously when the following year, the nationwide economic panic of 1857 devastated many Lake Superior settlements. The Pikes were among the 112 residents who remained and were able to remain in Bayfield. So this is another fun discovery. So I think one reason they survived is that Elijah had quickly built a substantial and functioning farm and mill economy. So this account from May 1859 provides a remarkably detailed glimpse of just how successful Pike's Farm had already become in just a few years. A Pennsylvania writer, in a letter to the editor of the Raftsman's Journal, a Pennsylvania publication, reported on Elijah's farm from the previous August. He reported enormous hay yields, abundant wheat, oats, potatoes, corn, rutabagas, onions, and turnips growing along Pikes Creek. He described Timothy grass reaching 4 feet tall, an 11-pound beet, which I think is kind of an exaggeration, 200 bushels of turnips and rutabagas from just 1/2 acre. But importantly, the writer emphasized that Pike believed Bayfield's soil and growing conditions were as productive as anything he had seen in Pennsylvania or Ohio. So they were both convinced that the South Shore might support not just speculation, but permanent settlement. This journal article is available in the Library of Congress. Chronicling America Project online is an online newspaper database. You can just search for the journal and the date. But it's a pretty lengthy article about Bayfield, Pikes Creek, Pike's Farm. It's pretty interesting. If you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to take a look. And it's one of the earliest, most extensive descriptions I think I've seen of Pikes Creek, Pike's Farm. Another fun find, an interesting characteristic of Elijah Pike. He was one of the central figures in Bayfield's early Methodist community. And much of what we know about this comes from the diaries of a Reverend James Peat. James Peat was a Methodist preacher who traveled throughout Lake Superior country in the late 1850s. According to Peat's diary, it was Elijah Pike who initially invited him to expand his ministry work from Minnesota and the Superior area into Bayfield around 1857. So there's some quotes from the diary here. The diary itself is available at the Minnesota Historical Society, but the Wisconsin Historical Society has the transcription, and it's a lot of fun to read. I think the Eleanor Knight book, Bayfield Stories, has some of the diary transcribed in it as well. But you can learn a lot about early Bayfield from just his comments. But Reverend Peat often stayed with the Pike family. He frequently described Elijah and Elizabeth Pike and their daughter Adeline as professors of religion, meaning they were committed Methodists. Interesting, and I mean no disrespect, but he never included son R.D. Pike in any description in that way. So make of that what you will. He didn't disparage R.D. Pike, but I don't think R.D. was as involved in the Methodist community as maybe his parents and sister. Elijah and Elizabeth quickly became leaders in the church community. Elijah helped organize the first Methodist Episcopal Church. He served as a trustee. He donated money, food, lumber, and supplies. Pete's diary frequently mentions his generosity. Elijah Pike will give $25 and sell board, or simply something like, Pike gave me potatoes today. It's interesting, often Reverend Pete would journey from LaPointe to Pikes Creek, and he would row himself in a rowboat across the bay. And so I can imagine after that journey, he would stay multiple days in a row with Elijah, probably to recover from that experience. But the diaries also show the Pikes' family's commitment to education and community life. Reverend Pete recalled loaning books to both Adeline and R.D. Pike. And one thing I thought was quite interesting, he brought back a pamphlet and talks about encouraging R.D. to attend Hamlin College in St. Paul, Minnesota, which I don't think he did. The diaries also revealed that Elijah was not the only Pike connected to early Bayfield. This is how we know that Elijah's brothers were here as well. Reverend Pete mentions Elijah's brothers, Moses Pike and Joshua Pike, quite frequently. As you can see from one of the quotes here, he was definitely unimpressed with Moses Pike's oratory skills. Heard Mr. Moses Pike talk for 1.5 hours, called a sermon very unsound in doctrine. He was a bit persnickety from his diary. I also have to tell you, he was distressed by Bayfield residents. He was lamenting their moral decline, the drinking, the dancing, the gambling, that they would go to a dance instead of going to a Bible class. I mean, he was heartsick over it. I wasn't going to say that. But long after Reverend Pete moved on from Bayfield in the early 1860s, the Pike family still remained leaders in the Bayfield's Methodist Episcopal community. By the 1860s and 1870s, Elijah Pike Jr. had become one of Bayfield's most recognizable public figures. Judge Pike, as he was known, because he served as Justice of the Peace, served as Justice of the Peace, town assessor, chairman of the town board, and eventually county coroner. To me, it seemed like if something needed organizing, repairing, supervising in early Bayfield, Judge Pike usually seemed to be involved. The town records repeatedly show him involved in Bayfield's very early infrastructure projects, roads, bridges, often supplying the lumber and materials to build the things that needed to be built. And a lasting contribution came in 1860 when he offered several acres of land for what became Bayfield's cemetery. I think an important gift to a community that was still establishing permanence. Another thing that struck me, how intellectually engaged Elijah remained throughout his life. He was active in Bayfield's Lyceum, and this was a public debate society where men discussed politics and current events. I've included some of the debate topics that were shared in the Bayfield County Press. It seems like every week they would share what the topic was and who within the community was taking what side. That's pretty interesting too. On the other side of the room, there's the Robinson Darling Pike exhibit, and one of the debate topics is included. And I'm sorry to say that Elijah did not believe women should be extended the right of suffrage. Wah, wah. Too bad.
RD did.
But RD did, so thank goodness. Love to see father and son arguing about that. But one debate topic delighted me, resolved the mechanic is more useful than the statesman. I can almost picture Judge Pike arguing that practical skills mattered more than politics. That struck me as kind of humorous. So I think of him not just as an early settler, but really an active force in Bayfield's community growth for the rest of his life. All right, here's another fun story. So it is true that Elijah Pike was a respectable, measured, church-going civic leader, attending meetings and debating issues, but the local newspapers preserved another side of Judge Pike entirely. In October 1872, Bayfield experienced what newspapers called the shooting affair at Bayfield. Very dramatic. According to the Ashland Press, quote, a desperado named McGillis had been drinking heavily and wandering through Bayfield town with a loaded revolver, threatening nearly everyone he encountered. Eventually, McGillis confronted Elisha Pike, pointed the revolver directly at him. Most people would probably back away from a drunken man with a gun, not Judge Pike. According to the newspaper, Mr. Pike caught hold of the pistol. The gun discharged during a struggle, badly injuring Pike's hand, actually blew off 2 of his fingers, wounding another man nearby, but Elijah succeeded in disarming him. McGillis was arrested, fined, and eventually escaped custody in yet another frontier subplot. And the newspaper absolutely delighted in the ending to the story. Quote, Mr. Pike has his revolver, which he proposes to keep as a token of McGillis's friendship and brotherly love. I know, it's pretty funny. I think that story tells us much about Judge Pike. He was tough, fearless, and entirely unwilling to back down. I think of him as kind of an old-timey Clint Eastwood, you know. So speaking of thumbs, that's my segue. If there's another thing that the Bayfield newspapers absolutely loved about Judge Pike, it was his agricultural expertise. Later in life, he became something of a local celebrity. He loved growing and raising things, potatoes, fruit trees, hay, dairy cattle later. The Bayfield Press regularly reported on him arriving at the newspaper office carrying enormous vegetables for display and consumption, almost like a one-man county fair. And here these, there are a few descriptions here on the slide, and they're pretty, I don't know, pretty exaggerated, I think, but one article described a mammoth turnip weighing 28 pounds. Another celebrated 23 snowball potatoes from one hill weighing 16 pounds. Not sure if that's true. But by this point, the newspaper proudly referred to Elijah as the champion potato raiser of the country. But I think it's important to note that success was real. Pike operated, by that point, Pike operated one of the area's most productive farms along Pikes Creek, raising grain, hay, vegetables, fruit, and eventually dairy cattle. In the 1880s, Judge Pike launched a major dairy venture. And then a few weeks later, the newspaper happily informed readers that the press office was treated to a jug of nice fresh buttermilk from Judge Pike's dairy. But I think it's important to note that he was well into his late 60s by this point, and he was still innovating and looking for new opportunities and ways to expand his farm and his life and his community. And I think that's pretty cool. So this was another really fun find. By 1879, Elijah Pike had become well enough known that visiting writers occasionally traveled all the way out to Pikes Creek simply to experience his remote homestead. Pikes Creek was Elijah's personal domain, his sawmill, his barns, livestock, trout streams, hundreds of acres of woodlands surrounding one of Bayfield's best fishing streams. And fortunately for us, one Minnesota Tribune correspondent left behind a remarkable description, remarkably detailed, of both Pikes Creek and Elijah himself. In Quiet Quarters, A Night on Pikes Creek, from August 6, 1879, Minneapolis Tribune. The article called Pikes Creek one of the wildest places one can imagine. The writer described a tiny farm surrounded by dense forest, springs, cold rushing water, so enclosed by nature that, quote, I can see the skies only by looking straight up. The homestead itself was its own frontier world. He documented an unpainted cabin, multiple barns, the old sawmill, a blacksmith shop, livestock, and of course the trout streams hidden deep in the woods. More importantly, the writer described Judge Pike in great detail. He described him as a genial spirit with good, hearty, practical sense and a determined will. But my favorite phrase of all from this article called him a large-hearted gentleman. And I think what makes this account so valuable is it gives us something rare in historical research, and that's real atmosphere. This article is available in newspapers.com. You can just search on the Minneapolis Tribune for that publication date. And it's pretty lengthy. It's about 3 or 4 columns of a full newspaper page talking about not just Pike's Creek and Pike's Farm, but the area in general. I think he traveled around the peninsula a bit, but it was really quite interesting. Really descriptive. You can almost picture the babbling creek, the weathered sawmill, the dense forest, the cabin smoke, but the isolation as well. And he describes Judge Pike, at the center of it all, still managing the little world he had built along Pike's Creek. That was very cool. So speaking of Pike's Creek and its fisheries, by the 1870s, overfishing and commercial pressures were already beginning to affect fish populations along the South Shore streams. Elisha Pike welcomed visitors warmly, but he expected them to respect both his property and the creek itself. So the Minneapolis Tribune article that I just mentioned has a little bit in there about this. He talks about Elisha Pike warning visitors not to fish in Pike's Creek without his permission because, quote, his eyes snapped fire when trespassers ignored his rules. And this is not just colorful storytelling. For years, after repeated problems with trespassing and folks fishing without his permission, Elisha placed formal warnings in the Bayfield County press. Sometimes they ran for weeks at a time, sometimes they ran for months at a time. But to me, this suggests that trespassing and overfishing was an ongoing and growing problem for him. So what I think is kind of interesting about this, long before formal conservation efforts arrived in northern Wisconsin, Elijah and both Elijah and his son R.D. Pike were already understanding that the region's natural resources were not unlimited. I think to them, Pike's Creek was not simply private property. It was something to be protected and preserved. And the Bayfield State Fish Hatchery right down the road grew from the private hatchery originally operated by Elijah and R.D. Pike. In 1895, the Wisconsin legislature authorized a state hatchery in northern Wisconsin, and R.D. Pike and others donated over 400 acres for that site. All right, we're getting close to the end. By the late 1880s, Elijah and Elizabeth Pike were no longer simply early settlers. I think they had become part of Bayfield's living history. And nowhere to me is that clearer than in the celebration of their 50th wedding anniversary in 1885. This was held on New Year's Eve in 1885 and hosted by their children, R.D. and Adeline. And it was far more than a private family gathering. According to the Bayfield Press accounts, more than 125 people attended, friends, neighbors, church members, civic leaders, longtime settlers who had also helped build Bayfield alongside the Pikes. And the celebration sounded wonderfully festive. Guests crossed a decorated bridge beneath an anniversary arch built in the couple's honor. There were speeches, music, enormous tables of food, and gifts ranging from elegant to practical. But perhaps the most meaningful gift was a cane presented to Elijah by his son, R.D. Pike. And remarkably, that cane remains in the Pike family today. Also, what stands out to me is the guest list. The newspaper account reads almost like a directory of early Bayfield society, kind of a who's who. But by their 50th anniversary, I think the Pikes had come to represent something deeply important to the community, and that's endurance. The celebration was obviously honoring their 50-year marriage, but also honoring their family, survival, and the successful creation of a community. Just imagine how far they had come. I think one of the reasons Elisha Pike Jr. survives so vividly in the historical record is that the local newspapers genuinely seemed to enjoy writing about him. By the late 1870s, Judge Pike had become one of Bayfield's best-known personalities, part civic leader, part agricultural innovator, and part frontier character. But there's real warmth in the way that the Bayfield newspapers described him as everyone's favorite enduring local character. Today, the Pike name most frequently associated with Bayfield history is usually R.D. Pike, and understandably so. His contributions speak for themselves. And if you don't know about his contributions, there's a beautiful exhibit in the other room. You can read a bit about everything that he did. But I think many of the traits later associated with R.D. Pike, adaptability, civic involvement, an entrepreneurial spirit, calculated risk-taking, I think can be attributed to the example set by his father. Throughout his life, Elisha Pike Jr. kept moving and reinventing himself. Farmer, sawmill operator, land investor, church and school builder, civic official, agricultural innovator, community leader, and conservation-minded landowner. Upon his death in 1887, the Bayfield County Press described him in this way: while always a man of decided opinions and a brusqueness of speech and actions, he was also noted for the warmth of his friendship. That may be the best summary of Elisha Pike Jr. we have. He was stubborn, tough, independent, occasionally blunt, but genuinely kind. And in many ways, Elisha Pike's greatest legacy may not have been the sawmill or the roads or the fish hatchery or the extensive farmland. I think it was the example he set for the next generation, especially his son, R.D. Pike, about how to build a successful life and community on the edge of the American frontier. And thank you for having me here tonight.
Well, today, I want to talk about my great-grandfather, Robinson Durling Pike, and his years in the Civil War. We all know that he was proud of his service in the Civil War, but up to now, we didn't know very much about what he did. But between Vicki and me and the National Archives, old newspapers, old books, we've pieced his story together, and that's what I want to tell for the first time tonight. Let's start with just the timeline of the Civil War and compare that to what R.D. did. So as we all know, the Civil War started in 1861 in April. R.D. actually did not enlist until a year later in 1862. He was sent down and fought in Mississippi under U.S. Grant in 1863. Then he fell sick, and then somehow, which I will tell you, he got himself out of the infantry into the cavalry and got a promotion to second lieutenant. Then he was sent to Virginia. He fought in Virginia, again under Grant, fell sick again. We lose track of him for a few weeks, but he went and visited family and went to Washington, D.C. Then next thing we know, he got a promotion and he's back with his cavalry unit, and he fought all the way to Appomattox to the end of the Civil War. And then instead of being mustered out, he was sent out to the Great Plains for the Indian Wars for about 9 months, mustered out in 1866 in March, and then he went prospecting for a couple of months before coming back here to Bayfield. So that's R.D. in a nutshell, and I could stop here, but I guess I'll go on a little bit more. This will be about 20 minutes, by the way, just so you don't worry too much. The Civil War was a long time coming. It was not a surprise when it came. Compromise after compromise had patched over the irreconcilable differences for 20, 30, 40 years until finally it erupted in April of 1861. And what's interesting about it, as some of you probably know, is everybody thought the war would be short. In fact, isn't that usually the way it is? We always think the war is going to be short. And furthermore, everybody thought we will win, both North and South. In fact, they were so worried that they might miss the war that picnickers came out and watched the first Battle of Bull Run. Well, the North did not win that battle. It became a long, hard slog. And by 1862, President Lincoln was calling for more volunteers. And that is when R.D. Pike signed up. He signed up in August of 1862, and he did not join the Wisconsin infantry. He signed up as a private in a Michigan infantry. And for years, we've wondered, why is that he went over to Michigan? And once we researched it, it became blindingly obvious. In that year, the closest recruitment stations for Wisconsin were in La Crosse and Madison, a day or two overland, where over in Ontonagon in Michigan, there was a ferry that went back and forth, 6 hours, 8 hours, and the Pike family was very familiar with Ontonagon. They stopped there before they went to Madeline Island. They would go there for supplies. So he knew it well, and he wanted to fight, so he went there. And it's a good thing he did too, because as I'll tell you in a second, he had to make 3 trips there. We found his enlistment document online. This is absolutely amazing. That's his signature, the same one you'll see out there on stocks and bonds and land deeds. But this is him at the age of 24 signing up to fight for 3 years. I, R.D. Pike, hereby acknowledge I volunteered to serve as a soldier for 3 years. And what's interesting, not only did he have to sign this, a surgeon, a doctor had to sign too, saying, I certify I've examined him. In my opinion, he's free from all bodily defects and mental infirmity. And also, he was entirely sober when he enlisted. You know, they make the doctor sign that, so no weaseling out, boy. It turned out he actually had to go to Ontonagon 3 times. We found, I think, Vicki, you found this, we found this amazing list of Ontonagon men who signed up willing to be drafted into the service of the U.S. Army, dated May of 1862. And R.D. Pike's name is on that list. So sometime before May of 1862, he made a trip number 1 to Ontonagon, got himself on this list of about 33 men. Then he went back in August to sign in. That was the document you just saw. Then they told him to go back home because we don't have enough men yet. And he came back in October. Finally, they had enough men there in Ontonagon, but not quite enough for the 27th Michigan Infantry. Those men in Ontonagon then took a boat all the way down here to Port Huron, where further men joined the 27th Michigan Infantry. In late 1862, they wintered over there, and finally they went down to Ypsilanti, just below Detroit. And it was only in April of 1863 that the 27th Michigan Infantry, with R.D. Pike as a private, entered service. And what's interesting is the Michigan Historical Society, Michigan Capital Commission, still has the battle flag of the 27th Michigan Infantry, the regimental flag. This is all that's left. But they also have the staff on it. It says, presented to the 27th Michigan Infantry by the ladies of Port Huron. As one flag after another got chewed up, they would replace it with a new one. But this is the one that R.D. Pike fought under, and remnants of it still exist. After they were in Ypsilanti, finally, the 27th Michigan Infantry itself was mustered into the Union Army, and they were sent right away to Cincinnati, Ohio, to what was called the Department of Ohio, to report to this gentleman in the 9th, who oversaw the 9th Army Corps, General Ambrose Burnside. General Ambrose Burnside was the commander in Ohio at that time, and some of you may know that R.D. Pike, after he came back to Bayfield, helped found the first Grand Army of the Republic Veterans Post here, and it's called the A.E. Burnside Post. That's probably why, because this was his first commanding officer. You may also know that this facial hair became very, very popular among the men in the 9th Army Corps, and they started calling them Burnsides, and they started to call them sideburns. So this is where the word sideburn comes from General Ambrose Burnside. This is where R.D. Pike went during that time. After they were mustered in, they went to Ohio, then they were sent down to the border of Kentucky and Tennessee, where he had his first taste of battle. A very brief skirmish with a Confederate unit, no Union casualties, 2 Confederate soldiers killed. That was June 2nd of 1863, but then Burnside got an urgent order to send the entire 9th Army Corps, including the 27th Michigan Infantry, down to Mississippi to help Ulysses S. Grant with the siege of Vicksburg. The 9th Army Corps comprised not just men from Michigan, but from Massachusetts, New York, Ohio, all over the North. And what's interesting is we know where R.D. was every day along this journey here down to Mississippi, thanks to the diary of a gentleman by the name of Henry Tisdale, who was in the Massachusetts regiment. Although I'll be reading you some of his words, this is the experience that R.D. went through. But I first want to explain what the strategic situation was at that time. In the spring of 1863, the Union Army controlled all of the Mississippi River, that's this blue line, down to Vicksburg, and the red portion here was still under the control of the Confederates. If the Union could take Vicksburg, this would fall, and the Union would control the entire Mississippi River, cutting off the Confederate from any supplies coming from the west. Extremely important. So that's why the Ninth Army Corps was sent down there. Here's Tisdale. On June 3rd, they took us by surprise. We were told to march. On June 4th, put on board box freight cars, stretched out on the floor, slept soundly all night. June 5th, a pit stop in Cincinnati. We had a good dinner provided to us by the city. Whiskey shops. Many of the regiment imbibed far too much. On board again, we had to endure the mad freaks and hilarity of half dozen or more in each of crazy-headed ones from the influence of liquor. So it wasn't all fun and games, but there were some fun and games. And there they go, down the Mississippi. June 6th, they're not the Mississippi yet, they're on a train going through Indiana and Illinois, the young ladies bestowing flowers upon us. June 8th, they get to Cairo, and that's Cairo, Illinois. They get on to steamboats there. The sceneries we steamed out of the Ohio into the Mississippi was pleasing. June 9th, I can hardly believe that I'm on the Father of Waters. So they're here around Tennessee. June 10th, heavy thunder showers as we go down the Mississippi. June 11th, allowed on shore, greenbacks in exchange for cakes, bread, fruit, cheese. They were in Memphis, which was now occupied by the Union Army. Didn't get back on board, the ships loaded with coal. June 12th, below Memphis, they finally see the real ravages of battle. Wrecks of rebel gunboats sunk during the attack of a year or more ago. But on our ships, lively music by bands on one steamer. Each steamer crowded with men, batteries and stores, a guard against guerrillas ready to pounce on our ships. June 13th, passed by many plantations, naught but ruins, bare blackened chimneys, blackened shrubbery. Fire had done its work. June 14th, they finally get to Vicksburg. Disembarked across from Vicksburg, they disembarked on the right flank there, a rough, swampy place, steep bank from the river, unloaded our baggage, shelling the city night and day, mules neighing, horses, our mortar boats. So thank you, Henry Tisdale. Those were his words of the Massachusetts infantry. He survived the war, went back to Massachusetts, got married, opened a store, and had 6 children. Now they're in Vicksburg, Mississippi, reporting to these 2 gentlemen who may look familiar to you, Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman. They were sent down there to assist in the siege of Vicksburg, which Grant had pretty much figured out by that time. Now, here's one of those complicated Civil War maps. I'm not going to explain the whole thing, but let me give you just the general idea. First of all, let me back up here. RD and the Ninth Army Corps were stationed here under the V. This blue semicircle here, that's the Union Army putting Vicksburg right here under siege with the Confederates desperately defending it. They got there like in mid-June, but before that, Grant had tried attacking Vicksburg from the right across the river. It didn't work, so he went down well south, crossed the Mississippi, went over and attacked Jackson, Mississippi, pushed out Confederate General Joe Johnston, and came back and put Vicksburg under siege. That's when RD and the others joined them. They joined in mid-June. By July 4th, Vicksburg had fallen. By the way, on July 3rd, Gettysburg had fallen. So that July, there was celebration throughout the North. After Vicksburg fell, RD, the 27th Infantry, and other units of the 9th Army Corps were told to chase General Joe Johnston, who had reoccupied Jackson, Mississippi. They attacked Jackson again, pushed him out of there again. He fled into the wilds of Mississippi. Then they were called back to base camp at Milldale, halfway between Vicksburg and Jackson. By the way, the town of Jackson, Mississippi changed hands 9 times during the Civil War. Can you imagine what it would have been like to have lived in that town, the poor residents? Anyway, RD was now in Milldale in the summer, late summer, early fall, and at that point, he fell sick with his first illness. We don't know exactly what it was. It was probably dysentery. It might have been cholera. He had chronic diarrhea. So he was sent in August to go back to this place called Camp Dennison, which was in Cincinnati, where he'd started from. So now in August and September of 1863, he's here, and he starts to feel better because he decided he wanted to take a trip. And he asked permission to take a short trip to Toledo up here. And it had to go all the way up to General Ambrose Burnside, who approved it and said, okay, in fact, I will grant you $4.16 of travel expenses, but be back here to Camp Dennison by October 13th, or we will consider you a deserter. Aye, aye. So off he goes. And then we found a newspaper article where he's checking into a hotel in Detroit on October 1. Now, maybe he went to Toledo, but that was not the reason why he requested permission to make a trip. He wanted to go to Detroit, and I'll tell you why. Because he saw this announcement in the Detroit Free Press. We are pleased to learn of the arrival of Colonel Towne of the 1st Michigan Cavalry for the purpose of filling up his regiment. He's going to fill up the regiment with new men, and he's looking for officers as well as men. R.D. Pike checked into that hotel on October 1st, and we found a record from Michigan archives that showed he was given a commission as of October 1st as a 2nd lieutenant in the 1st Michigan Cavalry. So he went back then to Camp Dennison and said, see, I made it back by October 13th, but excuse me, I have to go now. I'm in the cavalry. So off he went to Springfield, Illinois, to a camp called Camp Butler. That was for 2 months of cavalry training. Of course, he could ride a horse, but he needed to learn how to ride a horse like a cavalry officer does, how to command troops. And can you imagine, he was there, some 260 other fresh new recruits. In the meantime, 360 men from the 1st Michigan Cavalry, veterans, heroes, who had saved the day at Gettysburg with a saber charge, came and met these new raw recruits. And I can't imagine myself, even though I'm an R.D. Pike, saying to these men, well, boys, I guess I'm one of your new officers. Yeah, I was a private in infantry, but now here I am. Anyway, he did it. He got his training. He would have to prove himself, but spoiler alert, he did. So off he goes from 2 months of this to another camp, winter quarters in Camp Stoneman in Washington, D.C. Now, one thing I learned that I didn't really understand is in the Civil War, every winter, the war slowed down for both sides because it was hard to fight during the winter time. So each winter, when he fell sick, fortunately, maybe for him, there wasn't much fighting going on. Both sides could lick their wounds, reprovision, and get ready for the spring campaigns. So he was there up until March of 1864, and then thrown into battle, which I'll show you in a second. But we found his actual commission. Now, as we all know, Army bureaucracy moves very slowly, so even though his commission was as of October 1 of 1863, the actual document wasn't signed, the Special Order 123, until March of 1864. Private Robinson D. Pike, he's hereby honorably discharged as a private in order to accept a commission in the cavalry. So there you go. Now you're in the cavalry now, and he's not only in a famous regiment, the first Michigan Cavalry, it's part of a famous brigade. The Michigan Brigade, which consisted of 3, then 4 cavalry regiments, under this gentleman here, George Armstrong Custer, who led the Michigan Brigade, also called the Wolverines, also called Custer's Brigade. Custer, by the way, as young as R.D. Pike was a year and a half younger than R.D. Pike, and was already a general. So if this is anywhere near a picture of him at that time, he's only 24 years old. Sheridan wasn't much older. Sheridan had just taken over the cavalry under Grant's order and was given orders to change the cavalry from a reconnaissance and support force to an attack force. So just as R.D. Pike joined the cavalry changed into an attack force. And here are the first of many battles that R.D. Pike was in the cavalry. We have a list of all of his battles on his discharge papers. I'm not going to go through all these battles, but let me explain here also the strategic situation. This was a major campaign between Ulysses Grant and Robert E. Lee called the Overland Campaign. Grant is the darker arrows here, Lee are the red arrows. It starts up here in the wilderness and goes down to Petersburg, Virginia, just south of Richmond. And what Grant is trying to do is not destroy Lee's army, but cut him off from Richmond and Petersburg, because a network of railroad lines came up this way and fed the Confederate army. If you could capture Petersburg, you could starve out Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was interested in just pushing Grant back, causing him to flee maybe up to DC or beyond. So as they would meet, they would repeatedly fight and then disengage, as Grant is trying to cut Lee off and as Lee is evading that crabwise movement, until they got down here to Petersburg below Richmond, and at that point began a long siege of Petersburg. You couldn't go any farther south. So these are all those battles that R.D. Pike was in. General Custer wrote some after-battle reports of the 1st Michigan Cavalry that R.D. was in. For example, in the Battle of the Wilderness, way up here at the beginning, the 1st Michigan, under Lieutenant Colonel Peter Stagg, charged the enemy's advancing column and repulsed him handsomely, killing and wounding a large number of the enemy. Then the cavalry was sent farther south as an attack force, even while the main armies were up here. So down here, Yellow Tavern. The 1st Michigan attacked a force of the enemy, conducting up to 400 Union prisoners. They charged. They succeeded in recapturing all the men and a number of their captors as well. Down here, Meadows Bridge. The 1st Michigan drove the enemy for 2 miles, returning with many prisoners. So R.D. was in all of these battles in Virginia in 1864. And remember Peter Stagg, because that was his commanding officer for the next 2 years. Then at the siege of Petersburg, R.D. Pike fell ill again. The siege of Petersburg, by the way, was the first example of major trench warfare in the world, which was seen again 50 years later in World War I. So when you read stories of World War I and trench warfare, it was invented at the siege of Petersburg. Both the Unions and the Confederates dug in and pounded each other for about 9 months. R.D. was there from June to September, then he fell ill again. And here we lose track of him exactly, but we more or less know the story. We do know that he was then honorably discharged with disability. So he could have gone home at that time. But instead, next thing we know, he's reinstated. Then he goes and visits family for a while. Then he comes back with a promotion and rejoins his unit again. So what happened? Now, what's interesting here is we know what happened because we have one rare example of only 2 or 3 of R.D. in his own words. He wrote a letter to his sister and her husband. Unfortunately, we no longer have the original, but my grandfather transcribed it in the 1950s or 60s. So this is R.D. writing to them, explaining where he's been. Now it's March of 1865. Dear brother and sister, I will explain why you've not heard from me for a while. I received a discharge for physical disability. I did not wish to leave the service, so I started for Washington immediately. To explain to the War Department, I was absent by proper authority. And when I got through with that, it was necessary to go to Detroit to get a new commission. I guess because it was a Michigan unit, so you had to go back to Detroit. And it has kept me very busy. It has required considerable figuring. I am considered in the regiment very good at that kind of figuring. That is to say, I seldom get beat at anything I do. Oh, and by the way, I've got a commission as a 1st lieutenant and the regimental quartermaster, and also PPS. I've invested some money into oil in West Virginia. I think it's a good speculative investment. It may not work out, but it might be a good thing. So here's this guy in the midst of battle. I don't know, it sounds like R.D. all over, doesn't it? Anyway, now he's back for the final battles of the Civil War. We're talking March, April of 1865 here. Here's another one of those complicated Civil War maps that I won't go through, but the blue is the Army, the blue is the Union, the red is the Confederates, and the cavalry under Sheridan, their job was to get ahead of Robert E. Lee, who was fleeing westward, and interpose themselves between Robert E. Lee and Lynchburg, Virginia here. These 5 battles we know that R.D. was in: at Dinwiddie, at 5 Forks, at Sailor's Creek here, Appomattox Station, and the final battle he was there at Appomattox Courthouse. Here at 5 Forks, Colonel Stagg wrote this report about R.D. At 5 Forks, Adjutant Hill himself, in other words, R.D. Pike, Sergeant Cotton, and 3 men of the 1st Michigan Cavalry captured 169 prisoners, 19 of which were rebel officers. That must have taken a lot of bluff, can you imagine? But boy, five of them or so, captured 169 prisoners. Anyway, now the war is finally over. There was a bit of mopping up, and the 1st Michigan was sent to farther south in Virginia for a little bit, but the war was basically over, so they were going to be sent for a victory parade. But before we get to the victory parade, I want to point out a couple of things. This is RD with his 1st lieutenant shoulder boards. The highest rank he received in the military was lieutenant. We all call him Captain Pike. He didn't become a captain in the Union Army. He became a captain by captaining the local militia here, the Bayfield militia, some years after that. Also, I want to tell you a story about his sword and scabbard, which I still have in a safe in my home, and which will pass it down to other generations over here of the Pike family when I'm no longer around. According to my grandfather, my brother Arthur's grandfather, although this is R.D. Pike's Civil War scabbard, the sword is a Confederate sword because he lost his sword on the field of battle, so he picked up a Confederate sword and put it into his scabbard. And I think this is a wonderful metaphor of the United States. A Confederate sword inside a Union scabbard, a division, then a reunion of the two forces in the one country after the war. So we're very proud of having this heritage item from his service in the Civil War. Off he went in May to the big victory parade. Not only did they want to have a victory parade in Washington, D.C., they wanted to have it for another reason. Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated on April 14th, a week after Robert E. Lee surrendered. So the new president, Johnson, wanted to have a parade just to boost the morale of the troops. So off they go, and 98% of these men, regardless of their service commitment, were mustered out of the Union Army at that time. The war was over. But not R.D. and a few other members of the 1st Michigan Cavalry, because remember when he'd been discharged and got his commission, he had to sign up for a new 3-year term of service. Grant was desperate for soldiers to go out here to the Great Plains, where the Sioux, the Arapaho, and the Cheyenne were, but also where white settlers were streaming in before and during the Civil War, encroaching upon land that had been granted to the Native Americans. And by 1865, there were brush fights and guerrilla warfare all through this area. So Grant sent the 1st Michigan Brigade under Peter Stagg, including R.D. Pike, out here to assist the settlers and protect their settlements. There were several battles fought during that time. Fortunately, R.D. Pike did not have to engage directly with the Native Americans. He reverted to his role as regimental quartermaster, and he was there to help protect and provision the Oregon Trail. This is the route that he took together with Peter Stagg and the unfortunate other soldiers who had to go out here. And they did not want to be there, by the way. In St. Louis, about 1/3 of the men deserted, and there are other desertions up here. But R.D. stayed, Peter Stagg stayed, a few others stayed. Some of them actually fought in something called the Powder River Expedition. But R.D. was first stationed at Fort Laramie and then over here to Fort Bridger. During that time, first here's a couple of sketches of Fort Laramie and Fort Bridger. During that time, we know he met at least one and probably two of these gentlemen. Buffalo Bill Cody, William Cody, came here to Bayfield some 30 years later to visit R.D. Pike and swap war stories. Think about it. Cody was supplying the troops with buffalo meat, and R.D. Pike was a regimental quartermaster. Clearly, they got to know each other. R.D. Pike was buying buffalo meat from Cody. If I had more time, I'd read you some segments from my grandfather's story, but they had a lot of stories about, the tricks Bill Cody would play in order to pretend he was a sharpshooter when he wasn't. He used bigger bullets, basically. But Jim Bridger, whom some of you may have heard of, was also a scout out there. He was a scout for the Michigan Brigade, so R.D. Pike would have certainly have met him. I doubt that R.D. Pike met these two gentlemen. In fact, there's no photograph of Crazy Horse, but Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and a couple of other Native Americans were leading the combined Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Sioux forces, which basically defeated the Union Army regardless of what the newspaper reports at the time said, abandoning the Oregon Trail for some 10 or 15 years. This is before Custer went up there in his other incarnation, by the way. Well, fortunately, R.D. didn't have to get involved in that. He eventually was mustered out in March of 1866, but instead of going home, he decided to try some prospecting. His commanding officer, Peter Stagg, was going up to look for gold. He decided to go down in Nevada to look for silver. And we found these newspaper reports. Off for Paranaugut. Yesterday, Mr. Mills, the capitalist who arrived, started for Paranaugut. He is accompanied by Lieutenant R.D. Pike, who is well known to many of our citizens as the genial, whole-souled quartermaster at Fort Bridger, who doffed the blue in favor of the pick and shovel. We wish them well. But, he knew when to cut his losses. He was down there in the summertime. I was just in that region a couple weeks ago. It's north of Las Vegas. It's hot as blazes. And he was there in August. He only stayed a few months, and he came back. Another report in July of 1866, Lieutenant Pike of the Michigan troops left here today for the east via San Francisco. He intends to return. He did not. And he speaks in glowing terms of the new mining district. But he himself, I'm out of here. So it says San Francisco. He went back to Bayfield here via San Francisco. And I'll tell you why in a second. But first, here's his little expedition. Here's Paranaugut down here. This is Las Vegas. So in the blazing summer, he went down there. They had just discovered silver. He didn't find silver right away. He gave it up as a poor excuse. He went here through the Downer Pass on stagecoach and horse. Over here, then there was a train down to Sacramento, then a boat that you could take down to San Francisco. Then you could take a boat to Panama, go down to Panama, cross Panama, take another steamboat up to New York, and come back here to Bayfield. That's why he went to San Francisco. And this is R.D. Pike's entire journey during his military career, from Bayfield up here, all the way down to Mississippi, over to Virginia, then going out here to West, down here to look for silver. Oops, that was a mistake. Come back, go down to San Francisco, take a boat down here to Panama. There was no Panama Canal. It was a 3-hour train trip. 3-hour train here, get another boat, go up to New York, and then either take boats or trains back to Bayfield. He got back to Bayfield in September of 1866. We have his original discharge papers in our Pike family archives. I'm not going to read them to you because you heard all about it already. But it's wonderful to have the actual documents. That's why we know which battles he was in. Captured 169 prisoners, took an active part in all the engagements. He was smart enough to get it countersigned by General Sheridan. What this little part here says is, I take pleasure in bearing testimony to the correctness of these records. And Peter Stagg here said, in addition to all these battles up here, he's been in at least 100 minor engagements, skirmishes, raids, etc. So that was R.D. Pike's Civil War experience before coming back here to Bayfield. Now here's Bayfield, but he came back in 1866. This is Bayfield in 1886. Look over here. This is the R.D. Pike lumber mill. 20 years later. So between 1866 and 1886, he was already a major lumber tycoon. Quite a gentleman. So that was my great-grandfather and Arthur's as well. What can we say about R.D. Pike and his experience in the Civil War? Well, he is one of only a few Bayfield men who volunteered. In 1862, we only know of 2, maybe 3 others who volunteered. He got sick twice, but he insisted on getting back into the fight. Both times he could have gotten an honorable discharge and gone back home and said, I did my duty. But he got back. And not only that, each time he talked his way into a promotion as well. He took the opportunity while on leave to invest in oil wells. And I think this says it all. I seldom get beat at anything I undertake to do. So let's hear it from my great-grandfather, R.D. Pike. Okay, so the question is, when was what is now the Pinehurst Inn, which was the Pike Mansion, when was that built? And what was the Pike labor force that did all the actual work? I'll say a few words, and Vicki, you can add in. That Pinehurst Inn, the Pike Mansion, was only built a few years before he died. All the rest of the time, he was living here in Bayfield. They had a few cottages here in Bayfield. He built the mansion and moved into it maybe in the 1890s sometime. R.D. did, yes. It was R.D. Before that, his father had a log cabin there. And R.D. would sometimes spend time there, but he also had a couple of houses here in Bayfield and an office here too. As far as the workforce, it was a combination of Ojibwe and also Irish and Swedish and other Norwegians who came into the area, and whoever was available. Workers were flooded into this area because there was a lot of construction work available, not just working for R.D. Pike Sawmill, but for the railroads that were being built all around, as well as iron mines and other developments. So it was a workforce that was attracted into the area by the economic opportunities. Yes?
I have two questions. Vicki, where did Elijah Sr. come from landing in Maine? Where was he prior to
New Hampshire, Portsmouth, New Hampshire?
that? And then prior to that?
New Hampshire. So the Pike family for a couple of generations before that were in Portsmouth, New Hampshire is right across the bay from, thank you, Kittery, Maine. And so that's kind of the general area that the Pike family lived, I think, for 3 generations,
Yes,
right?
The first Pike, his name was Philip Pike. He came over in around 1700, maybe a year or two before. At that time, Maine was part of Massachusetts, so it was Kittery, Maine, but it was actually Massachusetts at that time. And there were some islands called the Isle of Shoals, so there was a lot of fishing and tannery works there at that time.
My second question is, do you have a map of where Elijah lived on Pikes Creek? Do you have a map of that? I heard you mention the barn and the iron and all that.
There's a great document. It's a Bureau of Land Management survey notebooks. Darren can probably talk a little bit about those. But in 1852, the government surveyed the area here on the peninsula, and they actually documented Julius Austrian's sawmill, the cabin on the property. And so that's the best map we have of where that was located. Where exactly it was located, we don't know. Is that correct? I mean, you've been looking for it for years, right?
No, I know where it's at.
You do?
There's actually remnants of the foundation.
Okay. Good question.
Yeah, Isaac Wing was also from Maine. I'm wondering if the two families knew each other or knew of each other and how they both came here.
You know, that's a very good question. But so far as we know, they met here. We have no record of the Wing family and the Pike family knowing each other before Bayfield. Great. Well, we've kept you long enough. I want to thank you very much for your patience, and thank you very much for listening to our story.